Okay, so let's dive in here. For those of you out there who really like to think about some of those deep questions of value and reason, like you, our listener,
Hmm.
the philosopher, is voting just that act of voting itself? Is it really like a truly rational choice, or is it actually more of a moral duty?
It's really interesting. It's almost like a very simple civic action, but when you start thinking about it, it just brings up all these questions about what it means to be a person in a society and your role in that society and all these big philosophical questions. It's really fascinating when you really start to dig into it.
Yeah, it's really a great topic, and that's exactly what we are going to try and do in this deep dive. We're going to be looking at the ethics and the rationality of voting, and we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to help guide us along the way. And, we know you, our listeners, you like to really understand things deeply, and you like to see the different perspectives on these issues. And we're going to try and help you see those aha moments without getting too bogged down in all the little details.
The Stanford Encyclopedia entry is a great place to start because it lays out the whole terrain, so to speak, of this big topic. And it's organized around 6 key questions. And we're going to be your guides through this material. We're going to point out the important arguments and some of the surprising things that come up. Just so many interesting angles to this seemingly simple topic of voting.
Right. So one of the big puzzles that comes up is the rationality of voting.
Right.
And this is something that economists have been wrestling with for a long time because they often think about human behavior through the lens of rational self-interest.
Right.
And so if you look at voting from that perspective, it kind of leads to this paradox of voting because the costs of voting, your time, the effort of educating yourself and going to the polling place, the costs seem to outweigh the very, very small individual benefit that your vote actually has.
That's really the crux of it for this model of the rational actor. If every choice we make is just about getting the most out of it for ourselves, the most utility, then why would we spend time and energy on something where it seems like our individual contribution is so tiny, so minuscule?
Exactly. And this leads to these instrumental theories of voting, where the idea is that people vote in order to bring about some specific outcome, like their candidate winning, or to kind of strengthen what people call the mandate of the winning candidate. And, there's a way to think about this formally, like using math, and it's this formula, it's the expected value formula, and it goes like this. U sub V, so that's the utility of the vote, equals P times the quantity V of D minus V of R, close quantity minus C. And what all that means is P is the probability that your vote is going to break a tie, and then this quantity V of D minus V of R represents how much more valuable you see your preferred candidate D compared to the alternative candidate R. And then C is just the cost of voting.
So it kind of sounds a little bit like buying a lottery ticket, right? Like there's a chance of winning, and the payoff could be huge, but the chances of actually winning are pretty small.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really where this instrumental justification for voting, it starts to break down. Because even if you think, candidate D is so much better and they're going to create all these much better policies than candidate R, well, the sheer number of voters means that the probability of your vote actually making a difference is just so tiny. Plus, trying to put a number on the value difference between these two candidates, especially when you're talking about things like, human lives or something like that, it just brings up all these complicated ethical questions about, how could you even compare those things?
It's really a problem to try and put everything into some kind of number or single value. And then on top of all of that, there's actually research that shows that a lot of voters, they don't really know that much about all the specific policies of the different candidates. So this idea that everybody is voting to achieve some specific set of policies, well, it kind of falls apart when you look at the data.
And yeah, we can even calculate, how small is this piece really? This probability of our vote making a difference. And if you use what are called binomial models, the chances of a single vote deciding the election in any election that has any reasonable size and where one of the candidates has any kind of lead at all, it's practically zero. There are other models, like statistical models, where they look at, past elections and the data from those. And those models suggest that, okay, maybe the probability is a little higher, but only in those elections that are super close, like the swing states. But even in those cases, for the vast majority of voters, the chances of your vote deciding the election are just incredibly small, like maybe 1 in a million or even less.
Well, there is one view that's more optimistic. Barnett says that the probability at the very least is 1 divided by the number of voters, so 1 over n. But even that view has been challenged because, it depends on certain assumptions about how voters are distributed and how they vote, and those assumptions might not always be true in the real world. Lyra and Enoch have pointed that out. And then, even in those very rare cases where one vote does make the difference, well, there could be lawsuits and recounts and all sorts of challenges. So it just adds another layer of complexity to this whole question of whether your individual vote really matters.
And some people have tried to say, well, okay, maybe our vote doesn't decide the election, but it influences the mandate. So the idea is that a bigger victory gives the winning candidate more power to actually do the things they said they were going to do to enact their agenda. So maybe that's why we should vote, to make that mandate stronger.
Yeah, and that's kind of an appealing thought at first. Like, if we vote for the candidate who's probably going to win anyway, it'll give them more of a push, more legitimacy, more power to act. Or, conversely, voting against them, even if they still win, might weaken their position a little bit.
But, the evidence for this mandate theory,
It's not really there. Political scientists have done a lot of research looking at lots of different elections, and they haven't really found that a bigger victory actually helps a politician get more done. So this idea that we can influence the mandate by voting, well, it doesn't seem to hold up when you look at the data.
right? And there's another variation of this, which is, okay, maybe we're not influencing the mandate itself, but the kind of mandate, like shifting the winning candidate from just representing exactly what their constituents want, like a delegate, to being more of a trustee where they can use their own judgment. But again, for the rational voter, the question is still there. Is this tiny, tiny chance that my vote is going to make that difference, is it worth the cost?
Exactly. It's the same problem with scale. The odds of changing the entire election are minuscule, and so are the odds of my vote changing the kind of representative the winner will be. It just doesn't seem like it would be worth it for a rational person who only cares about their own personal benefit.
Okay, so if influencing the outcome or the mandate directly isn't really a good justification for voting, then what other reasons might there be that would make sense rationally? And this is where what are called causal theories come in. And these theories are basically saying, look, maybe we value participating in the process itself, even if our individual influence is super small. We like being a part of that causal chain that leads to the outcome. It feels good to participate.
It's almost like you're getting some kind of satisfaction just from knowing that you contributed, no matter how small your contribution actually was, like a sense of civic duty, being a part of something bigger than yourself.
And then there's this idea of expressive voting, which is super interesting, especially if you're a philosopher. This theory says that voting isn't really about achieving a specific goal or anything like that, but it's more about expressing who you are, what you believe in, which group or ideas you align yourself with. It's almost like wearing a team jersey. You're showing everyone who you support, even if your presence in the stands doesn't actually affect the score of the game.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. And it actually fits with what we see in the real world with voters. A lot of voters aren't that informed about all the details of the different policies and candidates, and they may have biases towards certain groups. But if voting is really just a way of expressing yourself, like you said, wearing a team jersey, then it makes sense that you wouldn't need to be super informed. Just like Bob voting for a candidate because they take a strong stance on some cultural issue that Bob really cares about. It doesn't matter if the candidate's other policies might actually hurt Bob in the long run. The point is to express yourself.
And then there's the simple fact that a lot of people vote because they feel like it's their duty, like they're morally obligated to. If you look at surveys, a lot of people think that voting is just something you're supposed to do. And so you take that perspective that it's your moral duty, then voting can be seen as a rational action, even if the individual impact is tiny. You're voting because you feel like you have to.
And that brings us right to this next big question. Is there really a moral obligation to vote? And this is a pretty widely accepted idea, not just among regular people, but among philosophers too. The idea is that even if your vote doesn't really change anything, there's still something morally good about the act of voting itself.
But, like we saw with those instrumental rationality arguments, a lot of the usual justifications for this moral duty run into that same problem. The impact of one vote is just so insignificant. So how can we have a moral obligation to do something that doesn't really seem to make any difference?
It's like this argument that we have a duty to vote in order to save democracy from falling apart. Okay, sure, if nobody voted, that would be really bad for democracy. But the chances that your vote is the one that saves democracy, they're just so incredibly small.
There are other arguments, though, that are a bit more nuanced and maybe more convincing that go beyond just the direct impact of a vote on who wins. For example, there's Beerbaum's complicity argument, which is a really interesting one.
Yeah.
He says that because the people we elect are representatives, they're acting in our name, we have a moral duty to vote against things that are unjust. Because if we don't, it's like we're going along with those unjust actions. We're complicit.
That's a powerful way to look at it. So choosing not to vote isn't just some neutral thing. It's almost like you're passively accepting whatever policies the people in power decide to put in place. So the duty isn't just to vote, but to vote for justice and against injustice.
And then there's that classic argument that everybody's heard. What if everybody just stayed home and nobody voted? The consequences would be pretty disastrous. But, if you think about it, that kind of reasoning can lead to some strange conclusions. Like the source uses the example of farming. What if everybody stopped farming? We'd all starve. But that doesn't mean that everyone has a moral obligation to become a farmer.
That's right. The problem is that you're going from, what would happen if everybody did something to what each individual is obligated to do. The idea that we should contribute to the common good is a good one, but the logic of that specific argument doesn't really hold up.
Right, and that leads to what's called the free riding argument. So the idea is that even if you don't vote, you still benefit from the government, from all the things the government does that was put in place by the people who did vote. It's kind of like enjoying all the benefits of a park or a public library without actually helping to pay for it or maintain it.
Yeah, it's like you're benefiting from the system without actually contributing your fair share. Voting can be seen as a way of participating in keeping that system going, keeping democracy functioning.
But there's a problem with that, too. The source calls it the particularity problem. So even if we agree that we have these general moral duties like helping other people or being a good citizen, does that really mean that the specific way we have to fulfill those duties is by voting? There are lots of other ways to contribute to society, right?
Exactly. And Brennan and Freiman have made this point. They say that sometimes you can achieve those moral goals much better by doing other things, like volunteering your time or donating to effective charities. And Brown goes even further. He says that we have a general duty to do work that's good for society, civic work, and voting is just one possible way to do that, but not the only way.
But there's another side to that, too. Maskiv Kakker, he says, well, why not both? If you're someone who's already paying attention to what's going on in the world, you're informed about the issues, you're already involved in civic life, then voting is a pretty easy way to do even more good. It doesn't cost too much, but it can still make a difference.
It's almost like, if you can help someone out or do something good for society without it being a big hassle, then why wouldn't you do it? And if you're already informed and engaged, voting can be just like that.
And there's actually even this idea of a moral obligation to not vote in certain cases. Sheehy, for example, he says that if you really don't care about the outcome of the election at all, then voting is kind of unfair because your vote, which you don't really care about, could cancel out the vote of someone who does care a lot.
Yeah, and then Freiman expands on that. He says that for some people, especially those who aren't very well informed, voting might actually be like a form of ineffective altruism. Like, you want to use your vote to make society better, but you don't really know enough to make a good decision. So maybe your time and energy would be better spent doing something else, like donating to a charity where you know your money will be used effectively.
So we've talked about whether we should vote and even whether we should not vote, but what about how we should vote? That's a whole other set of ethical questions.
Yeah, it's like just because we have the right to vote, and that's super important for a democracy, it doesn't mean that all the different ways of using that right are morally the same. Just like, freedom of speech is important, but that doesn't mean you can just go around yelling, "Fire!" in a crowded theater.
Right, and the source points out some really key questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're thinking about how to vote. Like, whose interests should we be considering when we vote? Just our own, or our community, or the whole country, or even the whole world? And are there certain candidates or policies that we're morally obligated to support because they're more just, more fair, or because the candidate has good character? And what about our responsibility to be informed, to really understand the issues? Do we have a moral duty to do our research before we vote?
For example, those deliberative democracy folks, they really emphasize that we should be voting in a way that's good for everyone, for the common good, and that we should be talking to each other, having conversations, and really thinking through things before we vote. And others say that, look, it's okay not to vote sometimes, but if you do vote, then you have a responsibility to do it well, to vote well. But then, of course, the question is, what does it even mean to vote well?
And that brings us back to that idea of expressive voting. If voting is about expressing yourself, your values, then the morality of your vote kind of depends on the morality of what you're expressing. So, if you vote for someone who's openly racist, then your vote is morally problematic because racism is morally problematic.
That really highlights how even a single vote, which might not change the outcome of the election at all, can still have moral weight. It's like you're making a statement, you're aligning yourself with certain values, and that matters.
And then there's this idea of like an epistemic ethics of voting, where you're comparing voters to professionals like doctors or people on a jury who have this duty to be really well informed and make rational decisions because their decisions affect other people's lives. So the argument is that voters also have this responsibility to be informed and thoughtful when they vote because those political decisions, they have consequences, they matter.
But there's a problem with that comparison, right? Because the impact of an individual voter is so much smaller than the impact of a doctor or someone on a jury. If a doctor makes a bad diagnosis, someone could get really sick or even die. But if one voter is uninformed, well, it's probably not going to change the whole election.
But there's this principle that tries to bridge that gap. It's called the clean hands principle. It says that, look, even if your individual uninformed or malicious vote doesn't change the outcome, you're still participating in a collective action. You're still part of a group that is doing something that could be harmful. And so you have a moral duty to avoid being part of that, especially if you have the choice not to participate. They use the example of a firing squad. Maybe your bullet isn't the one that kills the person, but you're still participating in the execution.
That's an intense way to put it. And Maskivker has this interesting perspective where he emphasizes that being a good citizen, it's about both voting and trying to vote in a way that's well-informed and based on good principles. It's not one or the other, it's both.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about compulsory voting. This is the idea of making voting mandatory. And it's something that's been proposed as a way to deal with low voter turnout, which is a problem in a lot of democracies.
And the main argument for compulsory voting is that it would make things more fair and representative. Right now, the people who vote the most are often those who are wealthier, older, and more educated. So politicians end up being more responsive to those people's needs, and the needs of other groups might get ignored. Compulsory voting would force everyone to vote, which could mean that those less advantaged groups would have more of a voice.
It also helps with what's called the assurance problem. If people think their vote doesn't matter, they might not bother voting at all. But if everyone is required to vote, then that problem goes away. Everyone knows their vote is part of the whole, so it's more likely they'll actually vote.
Hill argues that this isn't about taking away people's freedom, but it's actually about making sure that democracy works fairly and effectively, especially in big, complicated societies where it's really hard for everyone to communicate and coordinate directly.
But there's some counter arguments too. If you force people to vote, they might not actually vote in their own best interest, or they might not have enough information to make a good decision. And even if everyone votes, it doesn't guarantee that politicians will listen to everyone equally.
And when you look at the research, the results are a bit mixed. Compulsory voting does seem to lead to higher turnout, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people will be more informed or that they'll talk about politics more or that the quality of political discourse will improve. It also doesn't necessarily lead to better policy outcomes. So just getting people to the polls isn't the whole solution.
Let's move on to another topic that's ethically interesting: vote buying. In pretty much all modern democracies, there's a strong moral opposition to buying or selling votes.
Yeah, and there are a few main reasons for this. Hazen lays out three main objections. One is that it's unfair because poor people are more likely to sell their votes, which gives an advantage to wealthy people. Another is that it can lead to corruption and inefficiency in government. And the third is that votes are not like a private commodity that you can just buy and sell. They belong to the community as a whole.
Now, the source does mention that there's actually a debate among social scientists about this, and some economists say that in some cases, vote markets could actually be more efficient.
And that shows how there are different ways of looking at this. Some people think it's just wrong, period, and then others say it depends on what the consequences would be.
And Brennan makes this really interesting point. He says that whether it's okay to buy a vote might depend on what that vote is actually for. So, he gives the example of paying someone to vote for women's rights or something like that, something that's clearly just and good.
That's a really thought-provoking idea. It suggests that we need to look at the content of the vote, not just the act of buying or selling it. But it's also really tricky to actually figure out how a vote was cast, especially with secret ballots. And there's always the risk of coercion, of someone being forced to vote a certain way.
Yeah, and, some of the common arguments against vote buying, they might apply to other things too. If the argument is that it harms the integrity of the democratic process, well, couldn't you say the same thing about political advertising? That's also trying to influence how people vote.
Exactly. It can be really hard to draw a clear line between what's acceptable and what's not when it comes to trying to influence political decisions. And the secret ballot, while it's good for other reasons, makes it really hard to know if someone actually kept their end of the bargain in a vote buying scheme.
Okay, so for our final big topic, let's talk about this really fundamental question. Who should be able to vote? And is this idea of one person, one vote really the most just way to do it? This idea that every vote counts the same, it seems pretty straightforward, but it's actually being challenged a lot these days.
Yeah, the first challenge is just figuring out who the people are who should get to vote in the first place. That's the boundary problem. Most democracies, they exclude certain groups like kids and people in prison, but they include citizens who live in other countries. It's not always clear why those boundaries are where they are.
Then there's this theory called the all-affected interest theory, which sounds good at first. It basically says that anyone who is affected by a political decision should have a say in making that decision. But then the problem is, how do you figure out who's affected and by how much? And it could get really messy. You might end up including people who aren't even citizens and excluding some who are.
Right, so there are other ideas too, like the possibly affected interests theory and the coercion theory, but those also have their own problems. Gooden, he makes this interesting point that maybe the reason citizens get to vote is because their interests are all interconnected within a country. But then, of course, national borders are kind of arbitrary in a lot of ways, so that complicates things.
And then there are these challenges to one person, one vote that come from within democratic theory itself. Like some people say we should have weighted voting, where some people's votes count more than others depending on how much they're affected by the issue.
The idea is that if something is super important to a small group of people, they shouldn't just automatically lose out to a larger group that doesn't care as much. So this weighted voting could make sure that those really strongly held interests get represented fairly, and it could maybe even solve some of the problems that come up with majority rule. But then again, it's really hard to actually figure out how much each person's stake is in a given issue, and there's always the risk that the system will be manipulated somehow.
And Bankston and Albertson, they take this affected interests idea and apply it to age. And they end up with this kind of surprising suggestion that maybe older people should have less voting power because they're not going to be around as long to experience the consequences of the decisions.
Yeah, that really shows how if you start moving away from the simple idea of one person, one vote, you can end up with some unexpected conclusions.
And then there's this whole other challenge that comes from outside of democratic theory, which is this idea of epistocracy, which is basically rule by the knowledgeable.
People who support epistocracy, they say that a lot of voters just aren't that knowledgeable about politics, and that's a problem for democracy. So they say we should give more voting power to the people who know more, like maybe extra votes for people who pass a civics test, or weighted votes based on how much education you have, or even like expert panels that can veto certain decisions.
The main argument here is that just like we trust experts in other areas, like doctors and lawyers and stuff, we should also trust experts when it comes to politics. They compare it to a jury, where the verdict is supposed to be based on facts and evidence, and the jury is supposed to be competent and fair.
But of course, there are counter-arguments to this, too. There's this theorem called the Hong-Page theorem, and it basically says that sometimes having a variety of viewpoints, even if some of those viewpoints aren't that well-informed, can actually be better than just having a bunch of experts. And then there's Condorcet's jury theorem, which seems like it would support the idea of epistocracy at first, but it actually shows that the outcome is only good if the average voter is actually making good judgments. If most voters are wrong most of the time, then having more voters actually just makes things worse. Plus, there's the worry that any system that tries to measure how much people know about politics will be biased against certain groups.
There's this idea of an enfranchisement lottery that's been proposed as a way to do epistocracy that's maybe a little less biased. Basically, you randomly select a group of people from the whole population, and then those people get a bunch of education and training on civics and stuff, and then they become the voters.
That's an interesting way to try and get the benefits of expertise without just giving all the power to an elite group. But practically speaking, it would be really hard to do, and it's not clear if people would accept it.
And then there's this really fundamental objection to epistocracy that comes from what's called public reason liberalism. People like Estlund argue that epistocracy, it relies on this idea of who counts as an expert, and that's a really debatable question. So any system like that, it's not going to be seen as legitimate by everyone, which is a big problem for any political system.
So in the end, we're left with these really deep questions about what makes a political system legitimate, how important is it for everyone to be able to participate equally, and how do we balance that with the need for good, competent governance?
Okay, so for you, our philosopher listener, we've covered a lot of ground here. We started with this surprising idea that it's actually really hard to justify voting based on purely rational, self-interested reasons. Then we looked at all the different arguments for and against a moral duty to vote, and we saw how tricky it is to measure the impact of a single vote. We talked about the ethics of voting itself, how we should be making our decisions. We even touched on these controversial ideas of making voting mandatory and allowing people to buy and sell votes. And then finally, we went all the way back to the basics, asking who should get to vote in the first place and whether all votes should be counted equally.
It really shows how voting, this thing that seems so simple at first, is actually connected to all these deep philosophical questions about rationality, morality, justice, and what it really means to be a citizen in a democracy.
And for those of you who like to think about these things, these deep questions, we hope this deep dive has been helpful and insightful, and maybe you even learned some new things or saw some old ideas in a new light.
It's a lot to think about, but hopefully we've given you a good framework to continue exploring these issues on your own.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. Given all this complexity, all these different perspectives on voting, what's the one question about voting that you think is most important for us to be grappling with right now, today?
It's a question that's always changing as the world changes, and there's no easy answer.
We really encourage you to keep thinking about these fascinating topics and to keep exploring the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and all the other great resources out there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.